Before we get into this one, I want you to sit with the title for a second. An Empress, a room full of the most powerful beings in a galaxy. And 4 words from her mouth send half the council into cardiac arrest. Not because he was dangerous, not because he broke a law, because she said she liked him. So the question I want you carrying through this whole story is simple. What kind of empire collapses at the idea of its ruler falling for the right person instead of the correct one? Let's find out. The throne room of the Virian Imperial Court had survived 4 wars, 2 assassinations, and 1 attempted coup by a duke who thought poison tasted better in wine than in soup. It had never, in 1100 years of recorded history, gone this quiet. Empress Isolde Th'Vane sat very still on a throne that was, by design, slightly too large for her. Her grandmother had commissioned it that way. Power should look like it's wearing you, the old woman used to say, not the other way around. Isolde had never liked that lesson, but she'd inherited the chair anyway. Along with the crown, the empire, and every single one of its 400 anxious advisors. Tonight those 400 advisors were arranged along the banquet hall in their usual formation bloodlines closest to the dais, lesser houses further back, and right at the edge of the room, practically hiding behind a wine fountain, the newly arrived human delegation. There was only one human in it. His name was Daniel Farrow, and according to the briefing packet Isolde had skimmed twice and actually read once, he was 34 years old, held the rank of special envoy, and had exactly 0 military decorations, which made him almost unique among every human who had ever set foot on Virian soil. Every prior human visitor had come from the fleet. Officers, commanders, men and women who walked like they were still counting exits. This one walked into the hall like he'd wandered in looking for a bathroom and decided to stay for the food. Isolde found that strange enough to watch him for a full 3 minutes before anyone noticed she was staring. Someone noticed. Your Majesty. Councillor Vantriosk leaned in from her left, voice pitched low enough that only she and the 2 guards behind the throne could hear it. You're looking at the human. I'm looking at the room, Isolde said. He happens to be in it. He happens to be in it. Osk repeated, like the words themselves were a threat. Osk was old even by Virian standards, which meant old enough to remember a version of this alliance that didn't exist anymore, back when humans were a rumor from 3 star systems over and not a fleet capable of turning half a continent to glass in an afternoon. Osk had been in the room during the Cresthaven incident. He did not talk about it, but everyone knew the shape of what it did to him. His left hand still trembled when someone raised their voice too fast. He's a diplomat, Isolde said. Not a threat. They sent a diplomat this time. Osk's eyes didn't leave Daniel. Last time they sent 3 warships and told us it was a courtesy escort. And yet here we are, Isolde said. Still alive, still speaking, still hosting a banquet instead of counting casualties. I'd call that progress. Osk didn't answer that. He didn't have to. His silence had a whole personality of its own, and right now that personality was screaming. Down at the edge of the hall, Daniel was doing something no one in this court had done in recent memory. He was laughing. Genuinely, unguardedly laughing, at something one of the junior translators had said, and the sound of it low. Warm. A little rough at the edges cut through the stiff formal murmur of 400 nobles like a dropped glass. A few heads turned. A few didn't dare. Isolde leaned forward slightly, chin resting against her knuckles, and found she couldn't stop watching him. It wasn't the laugh exactly. It was what came after it, the way he glanced around, a little embarrassed. Like he'd broken some rule he hadn't been told about, and then kept talking anyway because the moment was worth it. Nobody at this court did anything because a moment was worth it. Everything here was calculated. Every laugh measured. Every glance waited for political consequence before it left someone's face. She had grown up inside that math. She was, by now, fluent in it. It had been a very long time since she'd watched someone simply exist in a room without running the numbers first. You're staring again, Osk said. I'm an empress, Isolde said. I'm allowed to look at things. You're allowed to look at threats to assess them, Osk said. This is starting to look like something else. Isolde didn't answer. Because he was right, and she hated that he was right, and there is a very particular kind of irritation that comes from being caught doing something you hadn't even fully admitted to yourself yet. The banquet moved on the way banquets do, courses arriving in slow, ceremonial waves. Musicians playing something ancient and deliberately unmemorable so it wouldn't distract from conversation. Servers gliding between tables with the practiced invisibility of people who'd trained since childhood to never be noticed. Isolde ate almost nothing. She kept finding her attention drifting back to the far end of the hall, to the man who apparently hadn't gotten the memo that he was supposed to be terrified. At one point, Daniel caught her looking. He didn't look away first. Neither did she, for a beat longer than protocol allowed, and then he did something so small it shouldn't have mattered. He smiled, just slightly, and raised his glass an inch off the table in something between a toast and a hello, and went back to his conversation like nothing had happened. Isolde sat back in her too large throne and discovered her heart was doing something it hadn't done in years. She hated that too, mostly because she couldn't explain it, and Isolde Th'Vane did not enjoy things she couldn't explain. By the time dessert arrived, a Virian tradition involving spun crystal sugar that shattered into 100 pieces the moment a fork touched it. Meant to symbolize the fragility of good fortune, Isolde had made a decision she would later describe, privately, as either the bravest or the stupidest thing she'd done as Empress, and she genuinely wasn't sure which. She stood. The hall went silent the way it always did when she stood, 400 conversations folding into stillness in under 2 seconds. Because that was the reflex this court had trained into itself for 11 centuries. Even the musicians stopped mid-phrase. "I'd like to say something," Isolde announced, and felt Osco rigid beside her, sensing correctly, as it turned out, that whatever she was about to say was not going to be a diplomatic toast about interstellar cooperation. She looked down the long hall, past the bloodline tables, past the lesser houses, straight to the man standing near the wine fountain who had gone very still the moment every eye in the room turned toward him. "I think he's charming," Isolde said. 4 words. For a moment, nothing happened. The kind of nothing that has weight to it, a held breath the size of a room. And then, Counselor Osk made a sound Isolde had never heard a Virian make before, a strangled high gasp, both hands flying to his chest, and toppled sideways off his chair. He was not alone. 3 seats down, Lady Corvain Athos, head of the second house and famously the calmest woman in the entire Imperial bloodline, went white as bone and slid slowly, gracefully, almost elegantly, out of her seat and onto the marble floor. Across the hall, Minister Halbrant Way dropped his wine glass, clutched at his collar like it had suddenly tightened around his throat, and began making a wheezing sound that summoned 3 physicians running. Within 11 seconds, 6 members of the Imperial Council were on the floor of the banquet hall in various states of medical distress, and the remaining advisors were either frozen in horror or shouting for the court healers, and the human delegation, all 4 of them, Daniel Farrow very much included, stood there completely unsure whether they'd just witnessed a diplomatic incident or a mass poisoning. "Is this normal?" Daniel asked the translator next to him, quietly, as physicians in pale robes swept past carrying medical kits. "No," the translator whispered back. "This is not normal." Isolde remained standing at the head of the table, watching 6 of the most powerful people in her empire collapse because she'd said one true sentence out loud, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in that moment. She felt like laughing. She didn't. Empresses don't laugh while their council has a medical emergency, even when the medical emergency is, technically, entirely their fault. But there was something almost freeing about it, like she'd finally said a thing everyone had been too afraid to name, and the fear of it, once spoken, had nowhere left to hide. "Physician Kell," she called down to the man kneeling beside Osk, checking his pulse with practiced hands. "How is he?" "Alive, Your Majesty." Kell didn't look up. His heart rate spiked to nearly triple resting rhythm. Given his age, that's concerning, but survivable. "I believe it was shock." "Shock at what, exactly?" Isolde asked, though she already knew the answer, and asked anyway because some small, reckless part of her wanted to hear someone else say it out loud too. Kell hesitated. Then, carefully, diplomatically, the way court physicians learn to phrase things that could get them executed if phrased wrong, "I believe, Your Majesty, it was shock at the implications of your statement." "The implications," Isolde repeated. "Yes, Majesty, that I find someone charming." "That you find a human charming, Majesty," Kell said, still not looking up from Osk's wrist. In front of the entire court, during a formal banquet, 3 days after the anniversary of the Cresthaven incident, Isolde had forgotten the date. That detail landed somewhere in her chest like a dropped stone. 3 days. She'd set it 3 days after the anniversary of the one event this entire empire still measured its fear by. The one memory every advisor over the age of 60 carried like a scar they refused to show anyone. She hadn't meant it as a provocation. She'd meant it as the truth, spoken without thinking, the way things sometimes slip out of you before your brain catches up to your mouth. But intent didn't change what had just happened. 6 council members on the floor. A human envoy standing frozen by a wine fountain, watching an entire alien government seize up around one sentence. And somewhere behind all of it, underneath the panic and the shouting and the physicians rushing between bodies, Isolde Th'Vane was standing at the head of her own banquet table, watching a stranger from a species her empire had spent a decade fearing and thinking. With a clarity that frightened her far more than any of this chaos did, "I'm going to do that again." Across the hall, Daniel finally found his voice enough to lean toward the nearest guard. "Ma'am," he said, carefully in the halting Virion he'd been practicing for exactly 6 weeks. "Does this happen every time she compliments someone?" The guard, a woman twice his height with skin the color of dusk and eyes that hadn't blinked once during the entire spectacle, turned to look at him with something that might have been pity. "Sir," she said, "she has never complimented anyone. Not once. Not in her entire reign." Daniel opened his mouth to ask what that meant, exactly, and why it apparently came with a body count of fainting nobility, but before he could get the words out, the massive doors at the far end of the hall slammed open, and a courier in the black and silver of the Empress's private guard came sprinting in, breathless, straight past the collapsed counselors, straight toward the throne. "Your Majesty," the courier said, chest heaving, "forgive the interruption. There's a matter that cannot wait." Isolde's spine went straight. Couriers did not run. Couriers did not interrupt a banquet, medical emergency or not, unless the alternative was worse. "Speak," she said. The courier's eyes flicked, just once, to the human delegation, then back to the Empress. "It's about the envoy, Majesty," the courier said. "We've intercepted a message. Someone in this palace already knew he was coming, and someone already decided he shouldn't leave alive. Here's what nobody tells you about court intrigue: it's never the loud stuff that gets you. Not the shouting, not the collapsed counselors, not even the assassination threat itself. It's the quiet after. The moment everyone in the room realizes they have to keep smiling while someone plans a murder 3 tables over. That's the part of this story that actually unsettles me. So keep that in mind as we go back into that hall, because right now, somebody in that palace already knows exactly how they want this night to end." The banquet hall emptied faster than any formal event in Isolde's memory. Physicians carried out the last of the fainted counselors on floating stretchers, Osk among them, his color slowly returning as smelling salts did their work. The musicians packed up without being told. Servants cleared plates with the efficient silence of people who understood, without needing to be briefed, that something had shifted in the room, and it was safer not to ask questions. Isolde didn't move from the head of the table. She kept her eyes on the courier. "Say that again," she said. Slowly, a message was intercepted 3 hours ago. "Majesty," encrypted, routed through a private channel registered to House Th'Vane. The courier swallowed. It named the human envoy specifically. It said his presence at tonight's banquet was, and I quote, "an opportunity that should not be wasted." "An opportunity," Isolde repeated. "For an accident, Majesty." The word landed in the empty hall like something dropped from a great height. Across the room, Daniel had gone still in a way that Isolde was starting to recognize as his version of alarm, not panic, not scrambling, just a sudden, total focus. Like a man recalculating every exit in a room he'd walked into thinking he only needed for the food. "House Th'Vane," Isolde said. "Lord Corran Th'Vane." "Yes, Majesty. Of course it was Th'Vane." Isolde had grown up watching that family circle her like a slow tide, patient, polite, always 2 steps removed from anything that could be traced back to them directly. Th'Vane had lost a brother in the Cresthaven incident. Th'Vane had spent the last decade quietly building the loudest anti-human faction in the entire aristocracy, always careful to phrase it as caution, as prudence, never as hatred, though everyone in the room understood exactly what it was. And Th'Vane had a daughter Isolde's own age, a young woman named Issa, who had been paraded in front of Isolde at exactly 4 state functions this year alone, always with the same soft suggestion trailing behind her like perfume that a marriage between the houses would stabilize the throne, unify the old bloodlines, put certain fears to rest. Isolde had said no every time, politely then less politely. It appeared Th'Vane had decided to stop asking. "Where is Lord Th'Vane now?" she asked. His seat was empty for the second half of the banquet. Majesty. No one noticed until the collapse. Everyone was occupied. Isolde looked down the long hall to where Daniel stood, and for the first time all evening, felt something colder than embarrassment settle into her chest. Fear, not for herself. She'd lived with threats against her own life since she was young enough to still believe in things like fairness. This was different. This was fear for someone else, someone she'd known for exactly one evening, and the speed of that feeling frightened her almost as much as the threat itself. She stood. "Guards, escort the envoy to the eastern wing. Double the watch. No one enters that corridor without my seal. Not staff, not council, not family." She paused, then added, in a voice that left no room for argument, including House Th'Vane. Majesty, one of the senior guards started. "That is not a request," Isolde said. Daniel was brought to her rather than the other way around, which surprised him. 2 guards flanked him down the length of the emptied hall, and he walked toward the throne with the same unhurried, slightly bemused calm he'd carried all evening, though up close Isolde could see it wasn't calm at all. It was control. A man keeping his hands still because he'd decided somewhere along the way that showing fear rarely helped anything. "Your Majesty." He inclined his head. Careful. Correct. The kind of bow someone learns from a briefing packet rather than a childhood. "I understand there's been some concern about my continued survival tonight." "Someone wants you dead," Isolde said. "I'd call that more than a concern." "Yeah," Daniel exhaled, something that wasn't quite a laugh. "That tracks, actually. Been getting a weird feeling all night. Figured it was just the food. The food was fine. The food was terrific, actually. It's everything else that's been strange." He glanced past her shoulder to the empty seats where 6 counselors had collapsed less than an hour earlier. "Is it always this eventful around you?" Isolde felt the corner of her mouth pull despite herself. "No," she said. "It is decidedly not." "Good to know I'm special, then. You are currently the reason 6 of my advisors are in the medical wing and 1 noble house may be plotting your murder," Isolde said. "I would say special is an understatement." "When you put it that way," Daniel said, "I'm almost flattered." There it was again, the thing that had caught her at the banquet, that easy refusal to be crushed by the size of the room around him. Isolde had spent her whole life surrounded by people who either feared her completely or wanted something from her so badly they'd learned to hide it behind flattery. Daniel did neither. He talked to her like she was a person standing in a hallway, not a crown balanced on top of an empire. And something about that honesty cut straight through every careful wall she'd built over 26 years of rule. "I need to ask you something," she said, quieter now, guards a respectful distance back. "And I need an honest answer, not a diplomatic one." "All right, do you understand what I said in that hall? What it means, here, coming from me?" Daniel considered that for a moment. "I understand it wasn't just a compliment," he said. "I understand it cost something. I watched it happen in real time. It's more than that." Isolde looked away, toward the tall windows lining the hall, the twin moons hanging low and pale over the capital. In 1100 years, no reigning empress has spoken affection for anyone in open court before a formal proposal had already been arranged by the council. Every marriage in this bloodline for 11 generations has been negotiated like a treaty. Land for loyalty. Loyalty for peace. What I said tonight wasn't a compliment, Ambassador. It was the first unscripted thing this throne has said in over a century. Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its easy humor. "That's a lot of weight to put on 4 words. I'm aware. Why'd you say it then?" Isolde turned back to him and found she didn't have a clever, careful answer prepared, which, for a woman who had spent her entire life preparing answers, was its own kind of terrifying. "Because it was true," she said simply, "and I'm so tired of saying things that aren't." Something shifted in his face at that. Not surprise. Exactly. More like recognition, the look of someone who'd spent his own life in rooms full of careful sentences and had just heard one that wasn't, before either of them could say anything else. One of the eastern guards came around the corner at a near run, breathing hard. "Majesty, forgive the intrusion." He dropped to a knee, out of habit more than ceremony. "We searched Lord Draven's private chambers as ordered. He wasn't there. But we found this." He held out a small data cylinder, Virian military issue, the kind used for encrypted transmissions between noble houses and their private guard. Isolde took it, turned it over once, and felt her stomach drop before she'd even opened the contents. "Play it," she said. The guard activated the cylinder. A projection flickered to life above his palm, grainy, low resolution, clearly recorded in a hurry. Lord Corran Draven's voice filled the corridor, cold and precise, the voice of a man who had rehearsed cruelty until it sounded like reason. "The Empress has made her intentions clear tonight, whether she understands it or not. If she is allowed to continue down this path, the alliance with the human throne collapses, and every family that lost someone at Cresthaven watches their Empress choose comfort over memory. We cannot allow that. The envoy does not need to die in the palace. An accident during tomorrow's tour of the outer district will do. Quiet, efficient, deniable. By the time the Empress finishes grieving a diplomatic tragedy, the Council will have already arranged a more suitable match for her. One that doesn't require explaining to 1100 years of ancestors why their throne fell in love with the enemy." The recording clicked off. For a long moment, nobody in the corridor said anything at all. Isolde felt the data cylinder grow warm in her closed fist, her knuckles white around it. Beside her, Daniel had gone very quiet, and when she looked at him she found an expression on his face that surprised her, not fear, though he had every right to it, but something harder, colder. The look of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Tomorrow's tour," he said. "The outer district. That's on my official schedule. Public knowledge." "It is. So he's not hiding this. He's planning it in the open, banking on you not being able to prove it's him." "Yes," Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then I guess we cancel the tour." "No," Isolde said, and something in her voice made both the guard and Daniel look at her sharply. "We don't cancel it." Isolde Daniel caught himself, realized what he'd just done, using her name without title in front of a guard, in front of everyone, and to his credit didn't try to take it back. "You can't seriously be thinking about letting me walk into a trap." "I'm not thinking about letting you walk into anything," she said. "I'm thinking about walking into it with you." The guard's eyes went wide. Daniel's expression flickered somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like awe. "That's not how this is supposed to work," he said. "You're the Empress. You don't personally walk into an ambush meant for someone else." "I'm the Empress," Isolde said, "which means Draven has spent a decade assuming I would never risk my own position to protect a human diplomat I met 4 hours ago. He's built his entire plan on that assumption." She met Daniel's eyes, steady, something fierce settling behind her calm. "I intend to prove him wrong." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the capital, low and distant, the kind of sound that meant a storm was still hours away but already making its intentions known. Isolde stood in the corridor with a recording of her own death sentence for someone else's murder in her hand. A human diplomat watching her like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find in this palace, and a decision already made in her chest long before her mind had caught up to it. Tomorrow, they would walk into Draven's trap together. And whatever happened next, Isolde had a growing uneasy certainty that neither the throne nor her own heart was going to come out of it looking anything like it had before tonight. "Before we finish this, I want to say something honest. I've watched 100 versions of Royalty Falls for outsider stories, and most of them cheat at the end. The danger evaporates the moment it's inconvenient. The villain folds without a fight. Love wins because the plot said so. I didn't want that here. If Isolde was going to walk into an ambush meant to kill the man she'd known for less than a day, it needed to actually cost her something. So let's see what it costs." The outer district of the capital looked nothing like the palace. No marble, no crystal, no silence trained into every corner. It was loud and crowded and alive. Market stalls stacked 3 deep along narrow stone streets, vendors shouting prices in half a dozen dialects, children weaving between legs chasing something only they could see. Isolde had toured it perhaps 4 times in her life, always surrounded by enough guards to make the whole thing feel like a performance rather than a visit. Today there were fewer guards than usual. That had been her decision, made deliberately, made against the furious advice of every remaining council member well enough to walk. Fewer guards meant Draven's plan had room to breathe. It also meant, if something went wrong, there would be less standing between Daniel and whatever accident had been arranged. "You're doing the thing again," Daniel said quietly, walking beside her through the crowded market square, close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. "Where you go somewhere else in your head." "I'm counting exits," Isolde said. "That's supposed to be my job. I'm the paranoid human, remember? You can be paranoid and I can also be paranoid. It's not a competition." Feels a little bit like a competition. Despite everything, despite the storm sitting behind her ribs since the moment she'd heard that recording, Isolde felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. It kept happening around him, this small, involuntary softening, like her face hadn't gotten the message that the situation was supposed to be dire. They passed a stall selling dyed silk, then a fountain where local children were tossing coins for luck, and Isolde watched Daniel watch the city genuinely watch it. Not scan it for threats the way her guards did, but actually take it in. The color of the awnings, the smell of roasting grain from a nearby cart, the sound of an old man singing something slow and sad 2 streets over. "You really do like it here," she said, half to herself. "I like a lot of places," Daniel said. "But yeah, this one's got something." He glanced sideways at her. "Might be the company. You shouldn't say things like that. Not today." "Why not today specifically?" "Because today is the day someone is trying to kill you," Isolde said. "And I need you focused, not charming." "I can be both," Daniel said. "It's a skill." She wanted to laugh. She didn't, because at that exact moment her guard captain's voice came low and urgent through the comm bead in her ear. "Majesty, movement on the rooftop above the silk merchants, north side. 2 individuals, unregistered. They've been tracking your position for the last 6 minutes." Isolde's spine straightened without her permission. "Weapons?" "Can't confirm from this angle. Requesting permission to intercept." "Not yet." Isolde kept walking, kept her pace even, forced her expression into the same pleasant neutrality she'd worn through 1,000 ceremonial appearances. Beside her, Daniel had noticed the shift in her posture immediately. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. Quiet enough that only she could hear. "Rooftop, north side. 2 people. Been watching us for 6 minutes." Okay, he didn't look up at the rooftop, didn't change his stride, and Isolde felt a flash of something like respect at how quickly he'd absorbed the instinct not to give away that they knew. "What's the play?" "We keep walking. We let them think the trap is closing exactly the way they planned it. And then? And then it doesn't." They turned the corner into a narrower street lined with old stone buildings. Exactly the route listed on the official tour schedule, exactly the route Draven's intercepted message had referenced. Isolde felt the tension in the air shift, subtle but unmistakable, the particular quiet that falls over a street when the people in it have stopped moving naturally and started moving like they're waiting for something. The attack came from above. Not gunfire, not the crude tools of the incident that had scarred this world a decade earlier, something quieter, more deniable. A compressed charge fitted into the stonework of an old balcony overlooking the street, rigged to collapse the facade directly onto the section of pavement where the official tour route placed its guest of honor at almost exactly this hour. "Down," Isolde's guard captain shouted, and the world became noise stone cracking. A whole section of century-old balcony tearing free from its moorings. Market stalls overturning as people scattered screaming in every direction. Daniel moved before she did. His hand closed around her arm and he pulled, hard, dragging her sideways into the recessed doorway of a shuttered shop as the collapsing balcony came down in a roar of dust and broken stone exactly where they'd been standing 3 seconds earlier. Debris scattered across the street. Somewhere close by, a woman was screaming for her child. The dust hung so thick in the air that for a moment Isolde couldn't see anything at all, could only hear her own heartbeat and Daniel's ragged breathing right beside her. "You're all right," he said, still holding her arm, checking her over with quick, urgent hands, brushing stone dust from her shoulder like it mattered more than the chaos still settling around them. "Isolde, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Are you?" "I'm fine." He didn't let go of her arm. "That was supposed to be me. Right there. That's exactly where I would have been standing if you hadn't moved the schedule up 10 minutes. I know. You knew that when you decided to walk this route with me. I did. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, dust settling in his hair. The market square around them a chaos of shouting guards and fleeing civilians and the settling groan of stone that had nearly killed them both. And something in his expression cracked open in a way Isolde hadn't seen from him yet, not the easy charm from the banquet, not the controlled calm from the corridor, something rawer than either. You could have died, he said, protecting a diplomat you met yesterday. You could have died, Isolde said, because of 4 words I said in a banquet hall. I don't consider that a debt I get to walk away from. That's not why you're here. No, Isolde admitted. Quiet now. The noise of the square fading into something distant around the two of them standing in a shattered doorway. It isn't. Before either of them could say what it actually was, the guard captain's voice cut through the calm again, breathless. Majesty, we have him. Lord Th'Vane, on the rooftop across from the collapse site. He didn't run. Isolde felt something cold settle over the softer thing that had been building in her chest. Bring him down. Alive. I want him in front of the full council within the hour. They found Corin Th'Vane exactly where the guards said, standing at the edge of the rooftop with the strange, brittle calm of a man who had already accepted the ending of his own plan. When Isolde arrived in the makeshift council chamber an hour later, robes still dusted gray from the collapsed balcony, Th'Vane stood in restraints between 2 guards, chin lifted, refusing to look anything but composed. You should have died in that street, he said before she'd even taken her seat. Both of you. It would have been cleaner. Cleaner for whom? Isolde asked. For the Empire. Th'Vane's voice was steady, almost gentle, the voice of a man who genuinely believed every word. You don't remember Cresthaven the way the rest of us do, Majesty. You were a child. You didn't watch a fleet of unstoppable ships hang over this world for 6 days while we waited to find out if we'd survive the week. I lost my brother in that. Half this council lost someone. And you stood in a banquet hall and told us you find one of them charming. Like it costs nothing. Like 1100 years of caution just doesn't matter anymore because you like the way a human laughs. The room had gone utterly silent. Even the surviving counselors, Osk among them, pale but upright, said nothing. I understand your grief, Isolde said, and meant it, the anger in her chest making room, briefly, for something gentler. I understand it better than you think. But grief doesn't give you the right to plan a murder in my palace and call it strategy. It wasn't murder, Th'Vane said. It was prevention. It was an attempted assassination of a foreign envoy, Isolde said, during a state visit. Using an explosive device, in a public square, with civilian casualties as an acceptable cost. There isn't a version of that sentence where the word prevention belongs. Th'Vane's composure finally slipped, just slightly, something desperate showing through. You're going to marry him, aren't you? That's what this is. That's what all of this has been building toward. Isolde was quiet for a moment. Behind her, she was aware of Daniel standing near the chamber doors, not seated with the council, not yet part of any of this formally, watching with an expression she couldn't quite read. I don't know what I'm going to do, Isolde said honestly. I met him 3 days ago. I don't have a decade of careful planning behind whatever this is. What I do know is that it isn't yours to decide, and it certainly isn't yours to prevent with an explosive charge in a public street. She turned to the guard captain. Lord Th'Vane will be held under house arrest pending a full council review. House Th'Vane's seat is suspended until that review concludes. This was not a family tragedy responding to old grief, Counselor. This was a decision. Made with intent, and it will be treated as one. Th'Vane was led out without another word, the fight finally gone out of him, replaced by something smaller and more tired. The council chamber slowly emptied around them, advisors filing out in careful, subdued silence, until it was only Isolde, Daniel, and the low afternoon light slanting through the tall windows. That was a hell of a day, Daniel said finally, breaking the quiet. It was, Isolde agreed. You didn't have to defend whatever this is. He gestured vaguely between them, a little helpless, a little raw. In front of your entire council, you could have called it politics, alliance management, anything safer than the truth. I'm finished saying things that aren't true, Isolde said. I told you that in the corridor. I meant it. Daniel crossed the empty chamber toward her, slower than he'd moved all day, like this particular moment couldn't be rushed the way the rooftop and the collapsing stone had been. "For the record," he said, "I think you're terrifying. In the best possible way. I've met 4 heads of state in my career, and not one of them would have walked into a trap meant to kill a diplomat they'd known for a day. For the record," Isolde said, "I think you're charming. I already said that part, though, rather publicly." "Yeah." A slow smile finally broke through the exhaustion on his face. "I heard. Cost you 6 unconscious counselors and 1 attempted murder." "Worth it," Isolde said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Worth it," Daniel repeated, quieter now, closer now, and whatever careful distance diplomacy usually demanded between an empress and a foreign envoy seemed, in that particular fading afternoon light, very far away and very unimportant. Neither of them mentioned the treaty. Neither of them mentioned the council, or the succession, or the 1100 years of careful, loveless marriages that had come before this one moment in an empty chamber. There would be time for all of that. There would be arguments, and old houses digging in their heels, and 100 more advisors who would need convincing that this wasn't the collapse of an empire, but something else entirely, the first time in a very long time that its throne had chosen something honest over something safe. But that was a fight for tomorrow. Today, an empress who had spent her whole life being told exactly what to say, stood in a quiet room with a man who'd nearly died because she couldn't stop looking at him across a crowded hall, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had absolutely nothing careful left to say. So she didn't say anything at all. And for once, that felt like exactly the right choice. Here's the thing I keep coming back to with this one. Every empire and every story like this survives its wars. It's the quiet moments that actually test it, the ones where someone in power has to choose between what's safe and what's true, in front of everyone, knowing it might cost them everything. Isolde made that choice before she even understood what she was choosing. That's the part that stays with me. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in writing it, stick around, like it, share it with someone who'd enjoy it, and subscribe to HFY Soundscape, because we've got a lot more stories like this one still to tell.